In Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, the preacher gives his famous list of times and seasons, a lot of these things that have a proper time and proper place. And it's a famous passage, one well worth studying. We're going to do that this morning, looking at the specific things that he mentions, and then we'll take a step back and look at this in the context of the book as a whole. So turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we'll read verses 1 through 8. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. So other than being extremely poetic and pleasant to read in that sort of way, there's a lot of good lessons for us to learn here. And we'll just go down through the list here, looking at the comparisons that the preacher is making. First, he says there's a time to be born and a time to die. And this is speaking to that cycle of life that is outside of our control. Not a one of us got to choose to be born. In fact, many a despondent person has said that. I didn't choose to be born. I didn't ask to be here, yet here I am. And even outside of that, we didn't get to choose who we were born to or what time we lived in or even what place we were born in. All of these things were completely outside of our control. We also can't prevent death. We have huge industries built up around slowing and preventing the aging process. Many have searched for ways to avoid death. Sometimes I get a kick out of seeing what people with too much time or too much money try to do in trying to prolong their lives. And maybe my favorite one was the group of people who had convinced themselves that if they could get a hold of the blood of young, healthy people and inject that into themselves, that maybe they'll live forever. I don't know how that was ever supposed to work, and it's also really creepy. But regardless, no matter who you are, and no matter what resources you have or how powerful you are, or how healthy you are, and what steps you take to prolong your life, you still can't avoid death. It still comes. Every day, babies are born and people die. It happens in third world countries. It happens in wealthy, powerful ones. It happens in times of great abundance, and it happens in times of crisis and terror. For all that we have done to improve health and quality of life, we can't really end this cycle. Birth and death will continue to happen as long as the earth stands. Next, the preacher says there's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what has been planted. And any farmer can attest to the truth of this statement. You know that food for survival depends on knowing when and what to plant and when and what to pluck up and harvest. But really, I think this speaks to process. That there are a lot of things in life that very much depend on being done in the right order, and that you can't mix and match that. The story that we have in my family, and Lauren's not here, so I get to tell this, but is that when Lauren and I were dating back when we were teenagers, we decided, she came down to visit my family, and we decided that we were going to try to bake a cake together. And we were easily distracted and not paying nearly as much attention to the baking of this cake as we needed to be. And we managed to ruin this cake so horribly that it was beyond repair. So my mom said, go drive to the store, get the ingredients you need to try again. You can do it next time. We brought those ingredients back, and we managed to do it again. It was very bad. And it was my fault. I'll own up to that. I did not know how to bake very well at all, and kept assuming that if you had all these ingredients together, you're supposed to just mix them all, right? And that's not, in fact, what you do with every recipe. It matters what order you do things. It matters that you follow the instructions in some logical way. And I think on the third attempt, we eventually did get that cake right. And thankfully, she is a much better baker than me. But regardless, we know that a lot of things in life are like that. It matters the order that you go through. It matters that we look critically at something and think, what order does it need to go in? That can be with something as simple as baking a cake, but also with some of the fundamental things of life, of growing food, of doing things in their proper time. Then the preacher says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. This got serious really fast here. Often we want to heal and to preserve life. It's both understandable and honorable to bandage wounds, treat disease, intervene in life-threatening situations. And this is because God has placed a value on life. And so it is good to preserve it. But that makes it all the more noteworthy when it is sometimes necessary to take a life. You know, in God's covenant with Israel, he set capital punishment as the price for a number of offenses. And that was a serious thing. That was not God saying that your life is worthless and can just be, extinguished at the drop of a hat with no consequences whatsoever. It was because something truly terrible had happened. Many nations today practice some form of capital punishment, and there's a whole political debate about that I'm not super interested in getting into here this morning. But regardless, how sobering is that? Life is precious and sacred, and we rightfully condemn the bloodthirsty. In fact, that's one of the few things that most people agree on, that it's not good to go around murdering people. You don't need a particularly high code of ethics to understand that is a bad idea. And most people think it is a crime or an immoral act, or however they want to define it. Yet, we see that in the pursuit of justice, many things can be taken away from a person, from a guilty person. Their freedom, their resources, their property, and sometimes even their life. This is one example of a time when it might be right to kill, even as sobering and serious as that is. Well, there's a time to break down and a time to build up. And think of this one in terms of buildings. You can look at a building and say, this is old and dilapidated and not safe to go in, or it's not meeting the needs that we currently have. We need to tear this building down, and then we need to build a new one in its place, all shiny and new and with the latest trends, whatever the case may be. This is really about discernment, about the ability to judge what is useful and worthwhile. If somebody showed up this morning with a wrecking ball to destroy this building, or you got home today after services and somebody was there trying to destroy your house, you would be very upset. You would protest and say, don't do this. This is my home, or this is the building that we assemble in and worship God in, because we've judged that those buildings are useful. It would not be good to tear down that sort of building, yet there are others that are falling apart, others that you couldn't even safely enter that need to be torn down. So we have to be able to judge what is useful and what is obsolete. And this is about way more than just physical buildings. We have to judge the traditions we have, the things that we do individually, in our families, in our workplaces and communities, even in the church. There are many things in the church that are non-negotiable because God has commanded them. But then there are some things that are negotiable because they're just, the tradition of the way we've always done things. Or it's something that met a need that we once had that no longer is relevant now. And so being able to judge with a discerning eye and to say, is this useful or is it obsolete? Very valuable skill to have. There is a time to weep and to mourn, and a time to laugh and to dance. This is one about context, specifically with our emotions. When should we rejoice? And when should we be sorrowful? We are not supposed to feel the same emotion all of the time. The context that we find ourselves in dictates a different sort of emotion. And when we get this out of whack, we create problems. When we treat everything cynically and sorrowfully, we can't enjoy the blessings that we are given. Some people have the mistaken idea that God wants his disciples to be stoic and incapable of enthusiasm and joy. And that's strange, because God doesn't say anything like that at all. He wants us to have joy. He wants us to enjoy what he has blessed us with. Yet not every occasion is happy, and joy is not always the appropriate response. When we refuse to acknowledge our own pain, our legitimate emotional pain that we are going through, we merely cover up what lies beneath. And this creates disastrous consequences later. When we invalidate other people's grief because it makes us uncomfortable, we show that we don't have empathy. And we just shovel more pain on them. I have in progress a sermon on the subject of death and grief and how we handle that. That should be coming soon to a church building near you. And we'll be talking about some of these things, because I think a lot of us have an unhealthy approach to grief for ourselves and for others, that we tend to say, okay, you can grieve at the funeral, and then it's time to buck up, move on with life, and pretend like nothing happened. It's not right. That's not normal. And it's unhealthy for us to pretend like grief isn't a valid emotion to feel. There is a time to weep and a time to laugh. And when we suppress either one of those too much, then we only create problems. There's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. Wow, we're getting really generic here, aren't we? I think what this is about is another opportunity to consider context, but not about emotions. This time it's, if we want to give the physical example, imagine the difference between clearing a field versus building a fence. So if you have a field and you want to till the ground, you want to grow crops there, you need to clear out those stones that are in the way, that are going to make it difficult for you to till that ground. But then if you want to create a fence, you might be gathering those very same stones together because now they have a purpose. In some ways, I think this one is similar to the dichotomy of the building up and breaking down. But this time the object stays the same. This time it's the context that makes it different. We aren't trying to assess a useful stone versus a stone that is now obsolete. The stone is the same regardless. It's not like the building that has started to crumble and needs to be done away with. The stone is just a stone. But we consider the context, is it needed right now? Are these stones useful for the task at hand? Do they accomplish what we need right now? And so we decide whether we are collecting them together or setting them aside. And that's the case in something that is not inherently good or bad, but is about the context we find ourselves in. And we talked about this a little bit with a specific example in Bible class this morning here with the instruction given to the Israelites in Deuteronomy regarding charging interest. That interest was not some abomination to God that should never happen under any circumstances. He said, don't charge interest to your brother, but you may charge interest to the foreigner. It's because that stone, that interest, was useful in some circumstances, not useful in others. It was outweighed by other concerns when you were dealing with your brother. And so that sort of discernment and discretion, again, is very valuable. Well, then there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. This one is worded somewhat generically, but I want to make a specific point from it. One of the common claims that we hear is that love is never wrong, that any expression of love is never wrong, so long as it's not hurting anyone and so long as it's consensual, it should be celebrated. But we see here that, worded somewhat generically, embracing is not always appropriate. And while I would never go to this passage alone to try to construct a whole scheme for what God's plan regarding a sexual relationship is, I think it's getting at an idea that is expounded on in lots of other places in the Bible. That there is something to that physical relationship that is good and a blessing in its appropriate setting. It's a part of life to be enjoyed in its pure context of marriage, but it needs to be restrained in any other context. And that's what a lot of people miss with this. They will say, it's good, everyone is happy, God has given this to us, why should we restrain ourselves? Well, there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain. I think you could make other points from this as well, but this is one that is certainly found throughout Scripture. Then there's a time to seek and to keep, and a time to lose and to cast away. I think you can think about this one in terms of money. Is it a good thing to earn money? Is it a good thing to save money? Is it good to spend money? How about spending money on yourself versus spending money on someone else? When we talk about it that generically, the answer to all those is, well, it depends. It's good to earn money when we have the proper mindset toward it, when we are not allowing that to take over our lives and to prevent us from doing the other necessary things in life. It is good for us to save money. There's a lot of proverbs that show us the wisdom of not spending everything that you have, of saving some money because hard times inevitably come. There's always some need that comes up, some emergency or some unforeseen problem. So it is wise to save some of what you have for that winter time, that dark time that is coming eventually. It is also good to spend money. It's good to spend money on your own needs, on the needs of your family. It's good to spend money in helping others. It's even good to spend money to enjoy yourself. What this shows us is that our attitude toward our money, our possessions, all of these things needs to be balanced. We are not meant to have an overwhelming drive to accumulate money for its own sake, only to seek and to keep, never to spend. That some people treat money like a high score. Just get the number as big as I can, and that is valuable in and of itself. It's not. Money is a tool. Money is something to be used for a specific purpose. But we're also not to endlessly spend, and especially to spend what we don't have. There's a time to seek, a time to stockpile money, to build up your savings, and then a time to lose and to let that money go, to spend it on things. Because if you never do spend it, then it has not accomplished any good. Finding that balance will avoid so many problems, personally, and you also know that one of the leading causes of marital tension and strife and even divorce is money problems. And some of those money problems we might not be able to avoid. They might be outside of our control, but some of them are within our control because we are not wise in what we are doing. We do not have a healthy attitude towards the seeking and the losing. That we have to have the inflow and outflow make sense. Then there's a time to tear and a time to sow. This is usually understood by most writers I've seen as tearing the garments as a sign of grief, and then the repairing of that tear when the mourning season is over. There are some things that we might need to do in a time of grief that are just going to have to work then, but then we stitch things back together and we carry on when that time has passed. You can think of Jacob tearing his clothes when he mourned what he thought was the loss of his son Joseph, and real mourning, even mourning with consequences, is okay. But then there's also the time to pick things back up and to move on, at least physically, even if we cannot totally move on emotionally, even if we are changed forever by our grief, we can't be swallowed up in our despair. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. There are times when we should speak out, but there are also times when we need to keep our mouths shut. We can foolishly interject before we have the whole story. We can feel driven to make our opinions known on every little thing. Social media is good for that one. Everyone is an expert in every field imaginable because you read a headline on it once. We can feel compelled to speak when there's really nothing to say. I'm thinking again about those times of grief that you're trying to console someone, to encourage someone. Sometimes there isn't anything useful or helpful to say. But if you're the kind of person who doesn't have discretion, you might say something anyway, and you can end up doing more harm than good. So sometimes we need to stop talking. Sometimes we need to just be silent and to consider or to never say anything at all. But we can also be cowardly and not speak up against evil and injustice. We can be silent with the good news of Jesus. We can fail to encourage and teach and warn. So getting that discretion of knowing when to speak, what to say when we do, how to say it when we do, very, very important. The Bible devotes a lot of space to how we control our words, control the way that we speak to each other. Then there's a time to love and have peace, and a time to hate and to make war. We are always to love people and truth and righteousness. That never changes. We are to hate sin and lies and evil. And when we mix these things up, then we create some problems. When we start hating people because of the sin that's in their lives, well, then that doesn't allow us to be the influence and benefit to them that God wants us to be. When we start loving things that God actually hates, well, then we start to prioritize those things and to embrace certain things that God finds to be an abomination. Our every action should stem from those core attitudes. What do you love and what do you hate? And the Bible shows us that the longer you follow a certain path, the more your mind is molded in that direction. So as you are following Jesus, you love what he loves and hate what he hates. But the more you follow sin, the more you are corrupted to where sin makes sense to you. Sin is good and valuable to you, and God's way is the abomination. Even with war and peace, now we're kind of getting up to like a national level of things. We want peace. We want there to be cooperation between nations, among the whole world, for us not to be at war with each other. Yet we know sometimes that there's been a time for war, that it's not always avoidable. And that's one of the tragedies of this life and this sin-sick world, that people die in war, and countries and people spend a lot of time devoting themselves toward learning how to destroy each other and working to do that. And it's not a sin to be in the military. It's not a sin to go to war, any of those things. Don't misunderstand me. It's a tragedy that any of it is ever needed. And in a world where everyone loved God and worked the way that they should, it would never be necessary. And that's what God made us for. That's what his intent was from the beginning. And so we ought to see the heaviness of the difference between the war and peace. Okay, so that's an interesting list of things. We see these comparisons, how there's a proper time and place for different attitudes and actions. They're all worded somewhat generically. In fact, generically enough that on several of them, I think reasonable people can disagree as to the exact application. And maybe you did that with one or a couple of these where you think, oh, I don't know, but that's exactly what casting away stones means. The point here is not even just the precise applications of each one of these. I want us to zoom out for a moment and to take this in its context, because a lot of times Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 is discussed all by itself, and it's a famous passage, but it's surrounded by a lot of other discussion. And the book of Ecclesiastes has a purpose, and in some ways it kind of goes against some of what's said here. Not really. We'll talk about it. But it's interesting for us to compare. So what's the point of it all? I think there are a few big lessons to learn from this list as a whole. One is that there are some unchangeable parts of life, that there's a cycle to life that we can't ever really stop. Secondly is that we need wisdom to follow processes in life in logical, intelligent ways. Learn how things work. Learn how to accomplish something good in a logical way. We need discernment to see situations and people and things for what they really are. Being able to assess something and to know its usefulness, to know its nature. Very valuable. Don't always rely on what somebody tells you about something or on your first gut reaction to something. Be able to really assess and analyze and discern what something is. And then we need context to see how changing the frame of some actions or things can change their appropriateness. There are a lot of things in life that are not inherently right or wrong, but they're right or wrong based on what situation they're found in. And wisdom gives us that context to know what the proper thing to do is at all times. But take another step out. The preacher has bookended this before and after, really the whole book, with a woeful description of the vanity of life. The big key word in Ecclesiastes is vanity or emptiness. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And so verses 1 through 8 that we've spent all this time looking at, that's the whirling around of the endless cycles of life. There is nothing new under the sun. No matter what you do, people are born and die. You still have to plant and pluck, and you got to do it every year. You cast away stones just to gather them again later. You tear down an old building so that you can build a new one in its place that will one day be torn down so that a new one can be built in its place. And we see this cycle of things. We spend money to buy tools and clothes and education so that we can earn money, so that we can save money, so that we can spend more money. And then we have happy times and sad times that come and go like clockwork for everyone, no matter who you are and what you do. It's all really kind of exhausting. We can discuss the wise ways to approach these situations, but why do they keep coming at all? Can't we just stop? Keep reading in verses 9 through 13. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 9 through 13. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceived that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So when the writer of Ecclesiastes asks, what gain has the worker from his toil? As you read through the whole book, the answer is nothing, really. The rest of the book tells us that even with all of this wisdom and care, things can still go wrong in life. One of my favorite things to do with Ecclesiastes is to set it up against Proverbs. The Proverbs give us these general wise truths. They say things like, work hard and you'll be successful. Save money for a rainy day and you'll be prepared. Focus on the blessings of your own marriage instead of looking elsewhere, and you'll live a happy life with your spouse. Don't stoop to the level of a fool, lest you become a fool. Raise your children to love wisdom, and they'll remember that their whole lives. These are wonderful proverbs. They're there for a reason. They're things we should take to heart. But a proverb, by definition, is a general word of wisdom. Proverbs have exceptions. And Ecclesiastes picks up on that. Ecclesiastes kind of gives the nihilistic take some in saying, well, what if you work hard and you still fail? Has that ever happened? Yes, it happens every day, where people work hard and don't succeed. What if you save money and you still lose everything? You made wise choices, you tried to prepare for the future, and you were bankrupted anyway. Has that ever happened? Absolutely. What if you devote yourself to your spouse and she still leaves you? Has that ever happened? Yeah. What if you teach your children well and they grow up to spit in the face of God? Has that ever happened? Yeah. Are we disproving the Proverbs? Are we showing that they have no value? Of course not. We know that it is better to be wise and better to make good choices so that we can hope for these better outcomes. And statistically speaking, you will have better outcomes if you make wise choices. But the chaotic unfairness of life causes many people to despair. Sometimes when people get this view of the world and see that they can really, really try and still fail, they just dive headfirst into nihilism. But there is no purpose to life. Kind of makes the question here on the screen look a little different now. What's the point of it all? Not just what's the point of those 8 verses. What's the point of any of this? What's the point of life? What's the point of trying if it doesn't guarantee success? It doesn't matter. All is lost. All is vanity. Well, the writer of Ecclesiastes goes through a lot of things like this. He does it with work. He does it with pleasure. He does it with any number of things all throughout the book on how life seems fundamentally unfair. But the conclusion that he reaches at the end in Ecclesiastes Chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, was hinted at in the verses that we just read about God putting eternity into our hearts. Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. After the preacher has gone through all of these sorts of these fundamental injustices and the chaos of life, his conclusion is this: fear God and keep his commandments. Then literally in the Hebrew it says, this is every man. Or some translations even say, this is man's all. I like all that. That's good. This is our duty. This is our purpose. The Proverbs give us ways to live better and wiser while we are here. And Ecclesiastes touches on that too, and some of those times and seasons help us to consider the wise, discerning approach that we need. But what Ecclesiastes is really showing us is that in the end, it's not about the children born and perished, the buildings built and demolished, the money saved and spent, the clothes torn and mended, or the happy and sad times that we go through. The way out of that chaos, the way out of the nihilism, is to remember our very purpose, that God put eternity in your heart. You were made in the image of God to have an eternal soul, to have a purpose that transcends the whirling chaos of this life. But doesn't mean that all things here and now are meaningless. It just means we don't derive our purpose from them. Even if this life is unfair to me, even if I make wise choices and still fail, I will succeed in what matters, in serving God, in fearing him, in keeping his commandments. And when he judges us all one day, I'll be able to stand in glory, knowing that my Lord has saved me. If you've ever struggled with those nihilistic thoughts, wondering what life is really about and if it's really worth it, Ecclesiastes has your answer. And I hope that this has been helpful to you. So take these 2 lessons from it. Be wise in what you're doing. Have the discernment and context needed to do wise and careful things here in this life. And even if it all falls apart, physically speaking, God gives you what matters. Put him first, and you will have eternal life. If we can help you in some way this morning, if you're ready to come to him and to be baptized and have your sins washed away, we're ready to help you. We would love to help you. Whatever we can do for you, please come as together we stand and sing.